All right, well, good morning. How's everybody today? Are you enjoying the conference? Yes. So I know there's a lot of hands, and Ron's already talked about it a little bit this morning, but I know there's one particular that we've been working with pretty close from our region, and that's Tiffany Richards. And where is Tiffany? Is she even working still, or is she sitting around in here somewhere? Yeah, well, anyway, when she comes back around, we might see she's working somewhere. That's Jeff going to find her. But these take a lot of work to put on. If you haven't ever done one, you should have to do one someday. So it costs a lot of money. It takes a lot of work. Somebody has to dedicate their time. And yeah, it just seems to come for the rest of us. And we get here and we're like, oh, that was great. And we go home. Yes. I just wanted to say thank you for her. Yeah. Thank you so much. And I know there's several others as well from Arizona TC that have been helping out, and I just want to say a big thank you to them. Snow leaned over to me just a few minutes ago, and he said, you know, you guys are next. You're hosting it next time. And I said, bring it on. So that way I can bring 70 or 80 staff to it because it'll be in my backyard. So, yes, I appreciate the introduction, Russ, and I always count it a privilege to follow Ron on the stage when I get the opportunities to even be in the same room with my good friend and mentor from the South, and he is part of the DNA of Teen Challenge. Obviously, he's part of the legacy of Teen Challenge, and he's challenged us today again, and when he spoke the other night, to get back to evangelism. It just keeps ringing at all of these conferences, and every time we get together with a group of leaders, it keeps getting back to how can we do more? It isn't enough just to sit inside of our offices and our residential centers and work with the people who make phone calls to us. We've got to get out where the people are. And that's how this all began. Ron told us that we are part of the house of David Wilkerson. And we were challenged at the 50th, 9 years ago now, by him to get back to the basics. And if we're part of that house of David and the tribe of Teen Challenge, then I challenge each one of you today to take that seriously. I know we have in the Northwest. We're working really hard. We've partnered with another ministry called BPM, or Because People Matter. It's now part of who we are. We've changed completely because we took that prophetic invitation that was delivered last year in Denver to heart. God told us there to put hope within reach of every addict across the face of the world, on this globe. And you heard Diane say that there's over 700 million people today that are wrapped up in addiction. Now, I'm not going to go to the bank with this statistic, but I heard it on Arizona's public television in my room the other day that 4 out of 10 Arizonans are addicted to prescription medication today. I don't have any backup on that. I just heard it on there, and who knows who that person was. But the bottom line is prescription medication has become an epidemic across America. And they're just regular people like you and me. And they need hope, and they need help. And so we've got to get beyond where we are, and we've got to take this seriously. I jumped way in past my notes because I was fired up by Ron's presentation and his worship and his message. So now I got to back up a little bit. I'm Chris. This is my wife, Lindy, right here. And yeah. So Lindy and I have been serving in the Teen Challenge ministry for 20 years. This year is our 20th. And I'm very excited to say that Friday is our last day of service for 2 or 3 months because our board has put us on a sabbatical as a gift. So when we go home, we're going home to take a break. And I'm very excited about that. And I have a great team around me that's going to be able to serve, and they won't even miss me. So that's the scary part. They're going to be like, what does he do anyway while he's here? But I also have my daughter here, Brianne. She's been with us for about 10 years serving in our ministry, and her husband is the guy with the stroller in the back. And the most important person in the room is the guy in the stroller, and that's Eli, our grandson. Yeah, well, my wife's pretty important, but he's running right neck and neck these days. We went through some pretty tough times with him this first year of his life. He'll be a year old next month, and I just appreciate all the prayers for those of you that are friends with us on Facebook. You've seen some of those postings, and today he's a healthy little guy and loving life, and it's exciting to see that. But it wasn't easy, and God never promised us an easy journey at all. And so I also have another little surprise for you, and I'd like Rick to cue up that video. I got a little message from my dad. So many of you know my dad, and I want to share a little video of him this morning. Good afternoon from Lebanon, Oregon. It's a great sunny day down here, and Dawson and I made the trip down to do a little visit with my dad and my mom. But today I just asked my dad, Mike, here to send a greeting to all of us here at the regional conference and share some words of encouragement.
I want to welcome all of you to beautiful Lebanon, Oregon. We always have sun like this. It doesn't matter what time of the year, and a nice even temperature. So it's a good thing. So welcome to our humble abode. This is where we ended up after I was in the national office. I did that job for 5 years, and then we ended up here in Lebanon to retire. My mind goes back to when we attended the first national or regional conference, actually, in Arizona that Snow put on, and Frank Reynolds. And Brother Frank, we didn't have 2 nickels to rub together in those days. We didn't have anything. And Frank invited me and Betty to come at his expense. And he paid our way, flew us down, put us up in a hotel, everything. And he said, it's putting money in the future. I remember telling him, I said, Frank, no way I could ever repay you for this, but I thank you for the privilege of being able to come. He said, well, I feel like we're putting it into the future. And needless to say, I didn't know at that particular time that I would still be part of Teen Challenge after all of these years. But my eyes were open to Teen Challenge, things that I never knew existed before. And I haven't regretted it one bit all of these years later. But that was a number of years ago now. But that was my first experience with a regional meeting. And then because of that, I was able to meet guys that I never would have met before. Guys like Dennis Griffith and Snow Peabody, Randy Rowe, some of these guys that have been around Teen Challenge for a lot of years. I really thank you, Chris, for inviting me to come and to share my heart. And it hasn't changed for Teen Challenge. It hasn't changed for the hurting people in the world that would never ever hear the gospel in a clear fashion. And people that would never know that they could be forgiven for whatever they've done in their life, and they could be made complete in Jesus. And so that's kind of the story of it.
That's the story of it. We interviewed about an hour of recording with him, and we're creating some things for our young leaders to be able to see, and it's kind of an emotional video for me. It's not easy to see your dad, like that. I remember the days when we would get in that little sports car he had in the early days of Teen Challenge. My dad loved speed, and he loved to move, and he's always been a mover and shaker, and he's always been in the action. And he's housebound now, and he has very little control of his body. My mom takes care of him, and they're at a decision place in their life of what's next. But you heard him. I've never lost the heart for hurting people. When I was young, I would travel with my dad, and he would sing a song. It was kind of a one-man band back then. We had no money. You heard him say we didn't have 2 nickels to rub together, and he would get in his car. And at this time, early on, it was this old Speed Delight Chevy van that they'd rescued out of a junkyard down here in Arizona. If you read his book, you can read the story. It was a Speed Delight van, a missionary gone rogue, and he turned it into a vehicle that he used in his own private junkyard business. And so the AG said, you can have that vehicle in Arizona if you want to go get it. So my dad went to Arizona and got this old van and cleaned it up. So we used to drive around Oregon in that van, me and him, and we'd go to these little church services. I was 13, 14 years old at the time, but I just loved to go because I loved to travel too. And God knew my future. I didn't know I was going because I was going to be in this organization. I was going because I wanted to get out and see stuff. And I wanted to get out and just go meet all the kids and the pastors' daughters of the churches and all the great things that you get to see. And he'd sing a song. So it was me and him, and he'd sing this song, and he'd sing it. He'd start every single service with it, and he'd say, "Every day they pass me by, I can see it in their eyes, empty people filled with care. Headed who knows where. On they go through private pain, living fear to fear. Laughter hides their silent cries. Only Jesus hears. People need the Lord." People need the Lord. You guys have heard this song. At the end of broken dreams, He's the open door, and people need the Lord. And it goes on, but I asked him to sing that the other day, and he got a little bit of it. And we got it on recording, and that's what I remember. And he would have this altar call, and then he'd ask, anybody in this room need the Lord? Go, yeah, hands would go up. Anybody have people that are addicted to drugs? The whole church stands up. And the altars would be full, and they'd take an offering. And sometimes these little tiny churches were so poor they couldn't afford to give an offering, but they would give one anyway, and then my dad would turn around and give it back. And then we'd get in the van and we'd drive home. That's how it started for us, and that's our legacy in the Northwest, 1982. My dad says he was called to the Teen Challenge Ministry when he was sitting in an Assemblies of God district council service, listening to some U.S. missions video, and up on the video comes Snow Peabody talking about Teen Challenge. And my dad says, that's it, that's what I'm supposed to do. And he was pastoring a church at the time. And he ran down to the altar after the service was over. He literally ran down to the altar, grabbed a hold of R.E. Book, which was our superintendent and my dad's personal mentor. And he said, I'm supposed to resign my church today and do Teen Challenge. Snow Peabody told me so. It's truth. And so Snow has always been an important person to our family, me and to my dad. And I remember Snow coming to Oregon and visiting us, and I met him when I was just a kid, young guy. It's legacy. You know, Dennis and my dad, they loved these conferences. And I remember those conversations, Dennis Griffith, and they would sit around and say, how can we get more people to come? Well, we got to do it somewhere fun. We got to do cool stuff. We got to get people to come. We can't just do it at an airport hotel. Nobody comes to that stuff. So they started dragging this group all over the place. And they started upping the ante year after year. And I remember in 2001, they took us out to Spearfish, South Dakota. How many were there? Anybody there? I was there. Okay, good. I'm glad. I got a few of you remember this. And we went to this little junky hotel, but we went all the way out there because we were trying to save this adolescent girls center in Sundance, Wyoming. And so we took an offering for that group and gave $30,000 to that little group out of this group. And a few months later, they were gone. They closed the doors. They used our $30,000 to close their doors because they needed to clean up. Well, that's what God had intended, so that's fine. But I remember on that trip, we got to climb up to the top of Crazy Horse. And I still have a rock in my office from that experience. And then the next time, in 2003, we went to Victoria, BC. For the same reason. trying to help a struggling teen challenge ministry. So they took us out of the country, and we went to Victoria, BC. Crazy. Everybody's like, what are you going to Victoria? That's not your region. Yeah, but they wanted to help that group. And so they brought them in, and they attended all of our stuff, and we got to go to the Butchart Gardens and walk the streets of Victoria, a beautiful place if you haven't been. But they kept upping the ante, and they kept upping the ante. And I remember on that particular trip, I had a guy that worked for me named Jack Albin. He's since passed, and Jack was a great brother in the Lord. He was a graduate. He was a Vietnam vet, and he had all kinds of complications from Agent Orange, including only having one ear. And Jack took a van to the border. We got on the ferry at Port Angeles. We went across. He pulls his van across. He gets out of the van. Border control's there. They run his ID and say, you're a felon. You're out of here. And we had to put Jack back on a boat and send him back home. He didn't get to come to the conference. That's what I remember about that conference, the traumatic experience of poor Jack not being able to go. But I also remember something else about that conference. I didn't have any money to go. I was directing the Spokane Center at this time, and I was a new young leader, and one of our leaders, many of you know, Jim Cottrell. Remember that name from the past? He called me on the phone about 2 weeks before the conference, and he says, Chris, I know you don't have any money to go, and I want to pay for your entire staff to go to this conference. And I'm like, are you serious? No, I can't take your money. He says, yeah, I want to pay. And he paid for us to go. And I'll never forget that. In 2005, we went to San Diego. Great time in San Diego. And then we went to Santa Clara, and we went to jail at Alcatraz. Then we came to Phoenix to the Buttes. Snow says, it's going to be hot, but you're going to love the resort. I said, let's go, man. And then we brought you all to Sun River. It's a great conference. And then back to Paradise Point in San Diego. And last time we went to Honolulu, Hawaii. Did you guys enjoy that one? Waikiki Beach and the sand and the shaved ice and all the good stuff that's happening there. And then here we are in Tucson. But it all started because of legacy. It all started because two leaders said, we want to do something great for our people. We can't always pay them enough money. They work really hard, but we want these regional conferences to be a treat. We want them to be able to find a place of rest. We want them to be able to find renewal in their spirit, and we want to provide them legitimate training when they go home. And I think, Snow, you and your team have done every bit of that at this conference, and you've kept that legacy alive, and I just want to thank you for that. But I also got to tell you that we have been challenged to live this life of legacy. And we have a great example in Scripture, and I'm going to run through these notes pretty quick. In 2 Timothy 4:7, we see Paul talking to us here, and he says to Timothy, I've fought the good fight, I've finished the race, I've kept the faith. Paul lived a life of legacy. He lived a life where his influence has outlived his time on this earth. And that is the challenge that we're left with today. It's not good enough just to wander through life. It's not good enough not to have a plan. It's not good enough to know where you're going. You see, we need to live our life in a way that it will outlive the time that we're here today. It's our responsibility. It's our calling as a Christian. You see, Paul was converted in Acts 9 in a very dramatic way. And if I had time, I could go into some other stories here, but we know that he had a Damascus Road experience. It's very similar to the experience of many of those that are saved, especially through the Teen Challenge ministry, including my dad. He was saved in a very traumatic way. You can read his book if you want to see that, but he fought a good fight, Paul did, and he kept the faith, and he finished the race, and he's left us with this legacy. He's left us with 13 books of the New Testament to live with. Some theologians debate that, but I'll go with 13. Paul left us with the theology that we are saved by faith. Galatians 2:16 says it isn't works, but it's faith. It's justification through Christ. That's the center of his teaching. Isn't that awesome to know? that it's a belief in Christ Jesus that saves us and saves all of those that are in our programs. But he kept the faith. He pressed on through many years of ministry, through persecution and imprisonment and personal sacrifice. But he kept running the race to the end. And he finished that race. He says, I consider my life worth nothing to me if only I may finish the race and complete the task that Jesus has given me to complete. I think that we would all agree, there's no arguing that Paul did just that. He lived a life of legacy. And he left us a great example of how to do it. All of us should strive to live this same way. A life that results in a successful and meaning present. That you're living today successfully, in the present, but building a brilliant and vibrant future. You see, that's one of the core problems for many leaders. They get so caught up in the future and what they can see out there in the future. Visionaries especially do this. Oh man, I can't wait. I'm going to go there. I'm going there. But they forget to live their life in a successful way in the present. And that's what drives all the finance directors crazy. Isn't that right, Scott? Yeah, there's my finance director right there. And we couldn't live without our finance directors because they pull our shirt tail back a little bit. Hey, we got to make payroll, man. We got to make payroll. We got to pay the bills. We have so many great leaders to rest on. So many have laid the foundation to build on. So many to remember. And Ron challenged us in his message that we must never forget our past. We must be grounded in our legacy. And our legacy is built on the biblical principles. And biblical principles never fail you. That's what you said. Is that where you're living? Do you remember where we came from? It's so easy for young generations to forget the hard work that was sowed in. Those sacrifices. You know, I can remember traveling with my dad, and I already told you this story, but I remember pulling into the Bates Motel in Vail, Oregon. The Bates Motel. And we pull in there in this little car that he had by this time. By this time, he was driving this little sports car, and it was really fast, turbocharged, and he'd drive at 120 miles an hour down the highway. And I was sitting in there loving every minute of it, waiting for my turn to get behind the wheel. I was 15 or 16 at this time. And we pulled into this hotel, and he says, this is the only room available. I'm sorry, we got to stay here. Okay, Dad, whatever. We get in the room, and all night my dad stood by the window. I kid you not, looking out the window like this. I said, what are you doing, Dad? Go to sleep. I can't sleep. There's people in the parking lot. They're looking at my car. They're messing with my stuff. I'm like, okay, Dad, but I got to sleep. So I'd go to sleep, and I'd wake back up, and he's still looking out the window. I traveled with my dad a lot. We traveled all over the region. We've traveled all over America. And his DNA flows directly through me, obviously. He shared many things with me. Some of them are interesting. Some of them I hold on to. One of the things his dad used to always say, my grandpa, I was very close to my grandpa, and he used to always say to us, if you got to look at the price tag, you can't afford it. But that's part of who I am now. If I got to go in and look at a price tag, I shouldn't even be shopping. My wife hates that because she's always looking at the price tags and stuff and trying to get the best deal, which I'm glad she does. But some other things that were really important to me is you got to have a thick skin and a tender heart to work in Teen Challenge. When I'd get to complaining about my Teen Challenge guys, he'd say, well, then just pray for a better class of sinners. When I'd get to complaining about not having enough money, he'd say, have you baited and casted your crab pots lately? No. Then why are you walking to the mailbox? Just simple teachings. Those of you that know my dad know he was a pretty simple guy. He just kind of just said it the way it was, and everything came down to some very simple things. One of his favorite sayings was, it's all about candy and money. you just give the people candy and you give them money, everything's going to be great. It's true. Think about it for a minute. Why do you think when you go to those leadership conferences and all that stuff, they always got big bowls of candy out, you know? But the most important thing he taught me was to live a life of legacy, I had to live it in faith. I still have my dad. He's still with us today. And I have one more little video clip from him. And I asked him what legacy meant to him. And I'm going to end with this and give you a challenge this morning. Anyway, talk for a couple minutes about legacy and just what it means to you.
Well, legacy to me is an inheritance. It really is. It's inheriting something that is maybe already functional.
Yeah.
But you've inherited it, and you make it better because of the past and because of the people that have followed. Legacy is like a will and testament. It's like your future. And if you don't have a good legacy, you don't have much. Yeah.
What does it mean to you to know that what you put your life's work into is still prospering and going and impacting people's lives?
It's amazing, Chris, to me. That's why I don't feel like that I'm the guy to give much advice, because all I did was try to be obedient in whatever God asked me to do. I didn't do anything great.
But you did. You laid a foundation for others to inherit.
Yeah.
All the young guys and gals that are working in this organization today, and all the staff that are working in this organization, they're literally working off of your inheritance, that initial obedience moment. Yeah. All I did was be obedient. That's it. That's all I did was be obedient and just wait for God and do what God wanted me to do. Today I want to ask you a few things, and one is, to live this life of legacy. It's one thing to inherit it. It's one thing to say you're doing it. But it starts with a complete surrender. I loved what we heard yesterday from Pastor Barnett. He said, you have to seek God with both hands, holding on to nothing. He was talking about how some people come to the throne and they put their hand up towards God and say, God, help me. The whole time, they're hanging on to something back. That's a confusing signal for God. We got to follow God's lead without knowing where He'll be sending us. We have to wait on God's timing without knowing when it will come. We have to expect a miracle without knowing God will provide it. We have to trust God's purpose without understanding the circumstances. You got to surrender. If you're struggling this morning, maybe it's because you're still holding on to some of your own desires in your life. That dream of all those things that you personally want. Or maybe you've got some stuff that's just leaving you from being obedient. Because as my dad said, all I was obedient. It wasn't an easy journey those first 10 years launching Teen Challenge in 1983. Technically was when we started. 1982 is when my dad started raising money. And I can remember that as a kid, being a part of that. And I remember those faith moments, and I remember my mom and my dad being so convicted to what they had surrendered to that it didn't matter. Nothing could shake them from doing it. And that's who we are as an organization today. You see, we're still putting hope within reach because there's hurting people passing us by on the streets. We're taking this prophetic invitation to put hope within reach to another level. And we're trying to be obedient and seek God's purposes for who we are and what we're doing. To live this life of legacy, you've got to live this life in balance with God. You've got to surrender yourself. You've got to live your life in obedience. You've got to live it in balance. What do I mean by that? You got to find out how to serve God, serve your family, serve your ministry all at the same time. It's something I've been really keening in on our leaders, and I keep telling them there's no winners, there's no losers. If God's called you to the ministry, He wants everybody to win. All aspects of your life to win. Don't leave your kids behind. Don't leave your ministry behind. Put it all in balance and follow Him and His purpose. And Paul leaves us with this focus and determination in 1 Corinthians 9, 24, 27. We must have self-discipline in our own life. What distracts us so often from living this life of legacy is all the distractions of the world, the time wasters, the things that get in the way, the things that we think we've got to do. I've got to check my Facebook. I've got to watch that game. I got to, whatever it is. Your hobbies can become a distractor. Good things can become a distraction. But if God's called us to live a life of legacy, we have to learn to live it with a focus and a determination. And in 1 Corinthians 9, 24, 27, it says, do you not know that in a race all runners run, but only one gets the prize? Run in such a way as to get the prize. That means you have to have the blinders on and everything else has got to get out of your way. Everyone who competes in the games goes into strict training. They do it to get a crown that will not last. But we run this life of legacy to get a crown that will last forever. Therefore, I do not run like someone running aimlessly. I do not fight like a boxer beating the air. No, I strike a blow to my body and I make it my slave so that after I have preached to others, I myself will not be disqualified for the prize. That's to me, that's to you, that's to everyone who isn't even in this room. It's to all of us. Let's stand and I can get some music, and I want to ask you some questions this morning. This is new to me in a sense because I'm of an age now where I'm approaching 50. You know, when you're young, you think, oh, I got my whole life in front of me. I got all kinds of time to kill. And as you grow older, you start thinking, oh no, I got to focus in on what God's really called me to do. I got to really start thinking this thing through, because if I'm going to end this race well, I've got to get focused. I've got to get trained. I've got to get the wasters out of my life. I've got to get my life in a balance. I want to be able to sit at the end of the race and say, all I did was be obedient. All I did was be obedient. We are challenged here to live our life with the end in mind. And sometimes that's hard when we're just focused on the day-to-day stuff. But we've got to keep our focus straight ahead. We've got to keep our focus on the end game, the result. And for me and for our organization, that's putting hope within reach, because people do matter. Putting hope within reach because there's millions and millions of hurting people all over the world. But if you want to be David Wilkerson or Mike Hodges or Dennis Griffith or Snow Peabody or Frank Reynolds or so many others, you have got to learn to live your life in a way that it will outlive you. And this morning, I want those of you that want to live that way, if you're struggling that way and you're struggling with that in mind today, that concept of living a legacy, I just ask you to come this morning. And we're going to have our leadership come, and we're going to pray with you today, and we're going to ask that God will begin to minister to your life this morning. Russ, would you come? Snow, Joe, would you come down? Ron, Randy, Dana, Diane, would you come? And Face and Lindy. If you need help in this way, if you're saying, you know what, I feel like I'm drifting, stuff just gets in my way, I just can't keep straight forward. And I know I'm speaking to leaders today, and many of you are full of passion and excitement. But there's so many of us that need this commitment to live a life of legacy and determination and obedience. And so with that, come on down, and we're going to have some music that's going to be played and a time of prayer as we close out this morning session in Jesus' name.